So my 6-year-old son, his name is Benjamin, and he is a passionate little guy. He feels things very intensely. He takes things to the extreme on a lot of things. For instance, something as simple as just food or eating breakfast is we make breakfast burritos at our house, and he loves them. And he's like, man, this is the best breakfast burrito ever. We went to Taco Bell yesterday, and he was, this is the best taco ever. It's so good. And then other things like sports. He got into football this year because he's in kindergarten. All of his friends are into football, and so he fell in love with Georgia, which is a good year to do that. And then after that, it's just anytime we're riding around town, he sees a car or a truck with anything Georgia on it. Oh yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Go Dogs, right? He's super excited about that. And last weekend, we went out to eat after church for my daughter's birthday, and so we went somewhere, and he got out of the truck, and he was like, man, I was like, what is wrong? He's like, all this litter. Like, why would people do that? Why would anybody just throw their trash on the ground? And I'm going, I mean, you're absolutely right. Like, I'm going to call the EPA, and they've got a new spokesperson, right? And then I thought, well, hey, if that's the problem, like if litter is the problem, then I'm just going to start calling his dirty clothes and all the stuff he leaves on the floor bedroom litter. But then I thought that maybe that would just make him dispassionate about litter. So I avoided doing that, and we'll just stick with regular litter for that. But he's passionate. He feels things to the extremes. He is intense about everything. And the same is true when he gets corrected or gets in trouble. And so he's not a big fan of getting in trouble, right? No 6-year-old is. But there's some 6-year-olds who they just stand by what they did, and they're like, you start to talk about it, and they're like, yeah, so what? That's not my son. Again, he just feels everything intensely. And so when we even begin to start to have that conversation, and he can tell where it's going, he just crumbles with intensity. His coping mechanism is just to avoid at all costs. And so if that conversation happens in the living room, he's got this go-to move, and it's half frustrating but half cute at the same time. And so we've got one of those sectional sofas that has the corner in it, and they come with all the extra pillows that you don't need, and they just get in the way, and so they wind up on the floor, and that's a whole nother reason they get in trouble, and we have to have this conversation. But we normally just pile those in the corner of the sectional, and so if we start to have that corrective conversation with him, his go-to move is he just turns, whatever he's doing, he just turns and dives into the corner of the couch where all those pillows are, so that he can't see us, and we can only see what's left of the back of him facing out at us. And right, he hasn't learned how to process his emotions yet, and so he just buries them and himself in the couch, right? And so I'm he's just hoping, hey, if I just lay here long enough, they'll stop talking. We won't have to deal with it. Like maybe they'll just forget why we're even here, right? His escape from reality is to hide, right? Not his whole body, but as long as he can hide his face, he feels like he's escaping reality. He does not want to be seen when he knows that he has done wrong. And so last week we started this series called The Masquerade, and it's about the mask that we all put on to avoid reality, to hide from certain situations, to pretend like certain things aren't happening. And last week, as we talked about it, as we introduced it, there's a few different reasons that we might do this, maybe some of the things that we're concerning ourselves with. Like, for instance, we are all concerned with how others see us. On some level or another, we're concerned with how others see us, what they might say, what they might do, how they might treat us. If they see us certain ways, like they could be mean. So on the physical level, right? We put on certain clothes, we brush our hair, we fix ourselves up a certain ways. We're intentional about the way we let others see us. But not only on the physical level, like on the emotional level, we do the same thing. On the relational level, we do the same thing. And if we're not careful, this sort of spills over into our spiritual life as well, so that we're concerned with how we think that God sees us. And I say how we think God sees us because He's God and He can see everything, right? But we tend to compartmentalize things and go, hey, here's my box where church and God and all this is, but I have this other box over here where I really don't want God to have anything to do with that. I don't want Him to see anything over here. So at best, maybe we try to hide it. But at worst, we're just trying to ignore the fact that God knows those things are happenings in our lives, right? And it gets even messier. It gets even messier than that, because then we become concerned. We're concerned with how we think others think God sees us. So we put on these masks for other people then as well, so that they think everything is fine, so that they think that we're on top of our spiritual game. And so while we're playing spiritual hide and seek with God, trying to not let him see everything, other people are asking us, how are you? And we're like, oh, I'm blessed and highly favored. Everything's perfect. Everything's wonderful. My relationship with God is great. Why do you ask? Right? And underneath those masks, underneath those facades, underneath that hiding, underneath all of that pretending, deep down, there's something underneath in us that's hurting. There's hurt. There's maybe loneliness. There's insecurity. There's fear. Maybe there's addiction, right? There's these things deep down inside of us that we want to overcome, but the problem is we just have no idea how to do it. And so our best solution is just to put on a mask, to pretend that everything is fine and hope that someday, somehow, one way or another, that it eventually will be, that everything will just magically go away and life will be the way that we want to do it. And so the reason that we put on masks is the same reason, really, that my son buries his face, and it's because of this. Our natural response to shame is to hide. Excuse me. Our natural response to shame is to hide. And we see this, if you're familiar with the Bible, the story of Adam and Eve, sort of that first sin, the original sin. As soon as they eat that fruit, as soon as they learn that their nakedness, that they're naked, they have shame, and they hide themselves from God, right? And my son, he hides himself from the shame of being in trouble because he doesn't want to have to deal with that. He doesn't want to be called out. He doesn't want to have that conversation. And when we feel shame, we hide as well. We do the exact same thing. If you've ever found yourself in a situation that's embarrassing or shameful, like we cannot get out of that quick enough, right? The conversation, the topic cannot change quick enough. We'll do whatever it takes. We'll come up with an excuse that we have to leave. We'll try to change the topic to get people talking about anything else. But in order to maybe avoid that situation in the first place, we put on our mask. We hide so that we don't get to that point, so that we don't have to feel that shame. Because personal shame is bad enough, but public shame, we want to avoid at all costs. Well, there's all sorts of things that can cause shame for us, right? Sometimes it's just feeling inadequate. Maybe we didn't we didn't know the answer if we got called on, or we didn't pass this test, or we didn't meet the mark or the quota we were supposed to at work, or maybe we just can't provide for our family the way that we think we're supposed to provide for them. Or maybe shame isn't caused by an inadequacy. Maybe there's a secret that you're trying to hide, something that you're trying to keep buried. You don't want other people to see, and so maybe it's an addiction. Maybe there's an affair. Maybe there's a moral failure. Maybe there's something socially unacceptable, like guys listening to Taylor Swift when a girl's around, right? There's just things that we don't want other people to know that might or might not happen. Just kidding. My family loves Taylor Swift, right? But for Jesus followers, for us, this hits on a whole other level with this shame thing, because not only are we concerned of hiding our shame from other people, right? We don't want to feel shame from God either. And when it comes to feeling shame from God, the root is this. The root of shame in our relationship with God is sin. And sin is a word that we don't talk about that much. And some may know this, the root word from sin that we get our English word sin for. It's an archery term, and it simply means missing the mark. And when we put it into a religious context, it means something much more harsh. It means to violate a divine law. Right? And sin really is, it's a little tougher to define. It's tougher to nail down than we think it is. There's some things that are very clearly spelled out to this is sin. But depending on who you're talking to, depending on their belief system, depending on their theology, depending on how they interpret the Bible, they may disagree on what is and what is not sin. And so even the simplest things, even the simplest things with sin can get a little messy. For example, we can probably all agree that from a very young age, we were taught that lying is wrong, or lying, in a religious context, lying is a sin. And so we're taught that lying is bad. And then as we get even older, we find ways to work around lying. And then we have to caveat the fact that, lying by omission or not telling the whole story, that's still bad. That's still a sin. And again, we can probably all think along those same lines that, hey, yeah, that's wrong. You shouldn't do that. Especially when we're talking about our kids and trying to raise our kids, right? That's bad. Lying is bad. But what do you do? What do you do when a 4-year-old asks you where babies come from? Right? All of a sudden, lying or lying by omission is not such a bad thing anymore, right? You are absolutely not going to lay out the whole story. You're absolutely not going to tell them the whole truth. Or maybe if we bump it up to all adults in a room, something just innocent, something as simple as, where do you tell that person that you're taking them when you're really taking them to a surprise birthday party? Or how is it that you keep your engagement plans a secret from the person that you're about to ask to marry you? Right? In certain situations, all of a sudden, a lie isn't a lie, or at least a lie isn't wrong, or it's not bad, or it's not a sin, right? So what is and what isn't sin can be complicated, right? And in our relationship with God, some of us will feel shame over sin, and some of us will feel shame over things that aren't really sin, but we were taught that they were. And then others of us will feel no shame over things that might be sin, but we're not sure if they are or are not, right? And while we may not all 100% agree on what is sin in every case, what we can all agree on, hopefully, is this, that we have all sinned. We have all sinned. In fact, Paul in Romans 3:23, he tells us this, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. If you've ever learned any kind of organized gospel presentation, it normally starts with that verse. And it's funny because gospel means good news, and I guess the good news is not, it comes a little later. That is not good news. It starts with not so good news, that all of us have sinned. Every one of us have sinned. And if we're honest, from time to time, all of us still sin, right? We put ourselves in a position to feel shame from God. And so we're in this constant battle between wanting to do right, wanting to do what we're supposed to do, and falling into sin and falling into shame with God. And so we think that if we're just good enough, right, if we could just be spiritually mature enough, then we could outgrow this problem of sin. If we could just get enough God in our lives, then we would stop sinning. We would stop having to feel that shame. And I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but if you're a Jesus follower, you have as much God as you will ever get in your life, right? Jesus told us that, hey, if you're a Jesus follower, that God lives in you and you live in him. How much closer do you need to get than that? Right? The reality is we don't outgrow sin. We don't become more spiritually mature than sin at any part. And if you think about it, even Paul who wrote the majority of the New Testament, probably one of the most mature Christians, we could all agree, and most people would say probably one of the most spiritually mature people that ever lived, right? Even he wrestled with sin. Even he fell into this same problem. And in fact, he talks about it in the book of Romans that he wrote to the church in Rome. And in Romans 7, verse 14, he starts this way. He says, we know that the law is spiritual, but I am unspiritual, sold as a slave to sin. So we pick up in the middle of this heavy theological soliloquy where Paul's talking about the relationship between the law and sin. And so the law really just talks about the Old Testament scriptures and all the rules that are found in there, the commands that are found in them. And for a Jew, the law was the basis of what was right and what was wrong. And it lays out all of the do's and the don'ts. And the law defined sin in Judaism. And so the law really what it brought was condemnation to people when they did wrong. And so we've got the law that is spiritual, right? It's godly. It came from God. And Paul contrasts it with himself and calls himself unspiritual. There's something in me at work against that which is godly, right? There's law, and because of that law, I am a captive to sin because I find myself sinning. And so he continues to explain it. He says, I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do. But what I hate, I do. And Paul is going to spin this web for us over these next few verses and just go circle around. And here's what he's saying. He says, I can't figure this out. I don't know why this happens. I don't know why I continue to behave the way I behave. And remember, this is Paul, most spiritual person probably that any of us can think of, wrote over, the majority of the New Testament, influenced many people, started many churches. He, outside of Jesus, probably had the biggest impact on Christianity. And he says this, the things I want to do, the things that I intend to do, I don't do them. I find myself not doing them. And even worse, the things that I've made up in my mind not to do, the things that I've consciously decided to avoid, time and time again, I find myself right back in the middle of those things. I cannot get away from them. So he says this, and if I do what I do not want to do, I agree that the law is good. As it is, it's no longer I myself who do it, but it's sin. It is sin living in me. He said, I don't know why. I don't know why this happens. I don't know why I fall back into sin. But every time I do, when I do what I don't want to do, I prove that the law is right. I prove that the law is good. And I myself am not good enough on my own. When I'm just talking about myself, I am a slave to sin. I am unable to keep the law. And then he says, for I know that good itself does not dwell in me. That is, in my sinful nature. For I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. He says, my sinful nature, that part of me makes it so difficult to do what is good, to do what is right. I want to do good. I want to be good. I know the difference between right and wrong. I want to do right. But he finds himself time and time again still doing what's wrong. He goes on, for I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do, this I keep on doing. Now, if I do what I do not want to do, it is no longer I who do it, but it is sin living in me that does it. Are you guys keeping up with all these do what I do, or don't do what I don't do? He is like going deep into this, right? Have you ever been around somebody who's just trying to think through something, trying to figure something out, and they just keep repeating it over and over and going on over and over in their head? Like, I feel like this is what Paul's doing. He's like, I'm just wrestling with this. I can't figure this out. I keep on doing what I don't want to do, and I keep on not doing what I do want to do, right? And he comes to this conclusion that if he's not doing good, the alternative for him is that he's doing evil. Because, like, not supervillain evil, right? But if the standard is perfection, and he's not achieving that, and he's less than perfection, then he is imperfect. And the opposite of perfection is imperfection, and the opposite of good spiritually is evil, right? And so there is evil in Paul that's causing him to do what he doesn't want to do, and that evil he calls sin. And so sin keeps causing problems for Paul. It keeps causing him to do what he doesn't want to do and to keep him from doing what he does want to do. It's causing him shame because he can't conquer what he's trying to conquer. He can't figure out that part of his life. So he says, so I find this law at work. Although I want to do good, evil is right there with me. He says, I find this to be true in my life. Excuse me. He says, I find this so true, I find this so constant, that he even refers to it as a law. Even though I want to do good, even though I have all of these good intentions, evil is right there with me. Sin is right there with me, drawing me away from what it is that I want to do and who it is that I want to become. He says, for in my inner being, I delight in God's law. Right? There's a part of me that finds joy. There's a part of me that finds comfort. There's a part of me that gets satisfaction in following God. And I know that's true about me. I know that's true of myself. There's part of me that strives after that. Deep down, I want that. Deep down, Paul wanted that. But I see another law at work in me, waging war against the law of my mind and making me a prisoner of the law of sin at work within me. Paul says, I delight in God's law. I delight in following God, but there's something else inside of me that fights against it. There's a battle There's a battle going on inside of me that's fighting against my good intentions, that's really outwitting my logic, that's able to outwit me, to outthink me, to convince me otherwise, right? It holds me captive by its allure. It holds me captive by its promise of pleasure. And so what he says is this, is what a wretched man I am. Who will rescue me from this body that is subject to death? So Paul finds himself just torn, afflicted by this battle between good and evil, between following God and following sin, between life and death. Paul says, how will I escape? How do I get out of this battle? How do I become victorious? Who is it? Who is it that will save me? I've tried time and time again on my own, and I just can't do it. Who will save me from myself? And his answer, thanks be to God who delivers me through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then, I myself in my mind am a slave to God's law, but in my sinful nature, a slave to the law of sin. Right? Who can win the battle? Who can save me from my bondage? He says it's God through Jesus, through what Jesus has accomplished. And here's what I found really interesting about this verse. After Paul talks about Jesus, after he talks about the fact that God saves him through Jesus, listen to how he describes himself. He says, so then I myself in my mind am a slave to God's law, but in my sinful nature, a slave to the law of sin. He says, I myself, in other words, when I try on my own, when I try to accomplish this in my own strength, in my mind, when I try to do it right, I'm constantly just reminded of my failure. I constantly find myself failing. I constantly cannot accomplish the things that I hope to accomplish. He says, because of my sinful nature, I am a slave to sin. I am still vulnerable to sin. And, I think, Paul, maybe I'm missing something, but, you conquered it through God, through Jesus, but it sounds a lot like you're still in the exact situation that you were in, that maybe you haven't changed at all. It sounds the same, really, right? You want to do right, but you're still a slave to sin. So what is the difference? What's the difference now that God has rescued you through Jesus, right? I keep waiting for this spiritual truth bomb that Paul's going to drop to be like, hey, here's the magic answer for how you can conquer sin. Here's the cure-all for your struggles with sin. And I think that we can all relate to Paul, right? If you're a follower of Jesus for any length of time, we go through these things where we're like, I want to do right and I want to avoid doing wrong, but we just still find ourselves doing what we don't want to do and not doing the things that we want to do, right? We have the desire to do right, but we find ourselves doing wrong. And even when we've committed to not do certain things, we find ourselves doing those same things that we made up in our mind not to do. Just like Paul, we are slaves to sin. And one of the ways that sin enslaves us is getting us to believe certain lies about sin and certain lies about ourselves, because sin is crafty. Sin it's appealing, really. It presents itself as logical even in the moment. It has a good argument for itself. It makes sense to us to do whatever it is that we don't want to do, but in that moment it makes sense, right? And so here are some of the lies, here are some of the rationale that sin uses when it's trying to convince us of things. First, there's more satisfaction in the sin than in God. And let's just acknowledge this for a minute. There is satisfaction, there is pleasure, there is something appealing in sin. If not, they wouldn't call it temptation to sin, right? If sin was like not appealing at all, none of us would struggle with it. But there is pleasure that comes from sin. And even when we find ourselves resisting sin, ultimately, we're just heightening the promised pleasure that comes when we eventually fall back into it. All right, sin convinces us in that moment that there's more satisfaction in the sin than there is in God. The next thing it tells us is, I've always been this way. I can't change. Hey, there's nothing you can do about this. There's really no point in avoiding this. This is just how you are. You can't change. Why fight it, right? If you don't believe that, or, maybe you're still trying and you just can't overcome it, it tells you this: there is something wrong with me. There's something wrong with you. Like, other people, that may work for them, right? But for you, you just can't do it. There's something wrong with you. Just go ahead and give up. You need this. Next, if my situation was different, I wouldn't have to do this, right? Maybe if life was better, maybe if I wasn't in this situation, if things were different, then I wouldn't have to keep falling into this. But because of how my life is right now, this is just my reality. This is just the reality. I have to do this. Sin is just a part of me. And then there's this: I'm going to feel like a failure anyway, so I might as well enjoy it. Hey, I know I'm going to give in. I've tried time and time again. I know it's not the right thing. Just tired of fighting it, so I might as well enjoy it. Right? Just trying to do better, just trying to avoid sin is not going to get us the long-term results that we want, right? It may work for a while, but eventually we're just going to fall back in again. We're just going to slip up again. And the thing is, most of us approach sin with like this sin management philosophy. We're trying to manage our sin. We're trying to keep it in check. And we think that, maybe if we can just fill our time with something else and avoid that and not think about it, or maybe if we can just add in this spiritual component, then there's no other time left to fall in to that sin. Or maybe it's like this, over here we've got this big sin. We're like, man, I've got to get rid of this sin. I know this is a big deal, so I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm just going to replace it with these other smaller sins, because if I do these smaller sins, eventually I can get rid of them, and at least I'm not doing this big thing over here anymore. And so we think that, hey, the way to deal with sin is just to like slowly reduce the effect of it and reduce our need and reduce our desire for it, right? But here's the deal: sin management, good intentions, they always lead us back into sin, because they treat sin lightly. They treat sin as if it's not powerful. And the reality is, sin is powerful, right? Sin management, good intentions, they assume that you can control sin. And before long, that becomes very defeating, and we wonder why we can't overcome it. And then even we maybe wonder if our relationship with God is broken. Maybe we doubt our relationship with God because of that. Did we do something wrong? Maybe my prayer wasn't good enough. Maybe my baptism doesn't work. That's not what baptism is for. But, maybe you didn't get under the water all the way. And so, it didn't wash all of your sin away. There were some still left attached. We just don't know how to deal with it. And our relationship with God sometimes suffers because of that. And so sin ends up distorting our view of ourselves, right? And we said it last week that putting on a mask is less about what others see and more about what we see. It's more about how we see ourselves, how we see God. And so sin changes how we see ourselves. It changes how we think that God sees us even. And so if we contrast maybe some of our view of how God sees us and how sin tells us that we're seen, God says, God loves me. That's God's view. Sin's view is this: God is disappointed with me. Because of this sin, because of this trap, because of this bondage that you're in, God's disappointed with you. He doesn't really love you anymore. He's disappointed. The next thing is this: I'm a new creation, is what God tells us. What sin tells us is my status has changed, but nothing else, right? You're still the same old person that you've ever been. Maybe you get to call yourself a Christian. Maybe you get to rest in that. But you're no different. Nothing else is different. You're still the exact same person that you used to be. And there's this. God says, hey, I'm at work in you. God is at work in me. Sin's view is this: I need to fix myself. If God's ever going to love me again, if I'm really going to be a new creation, if God can ever do anything with me, I've got to fix myself. God expects me to fix myself so that I can come to Him after I'm fixed, right? And this is what sin does. Sin tries to convince us that we are far from God. It tries to put this distance between us and God and keep us as far as possible away from him. Sin paints this picture for us. Imagine that you're there, and whatever you think of your sin or how great or how little, imagine there's just this heap, this pile, this mountain of sin in front of you. And imagine, right, you've got this heaping mess, and on the other side of this, you've got God. And God is looking at you through this mountain, through this hill, through this sin. And in order to see you, all he can see first is your sin. And we think that if we could just get rid of that sin, then God would be able to see us. God would be able to come close to us. But because of that sin, it's keeping God at a distance. And here's the deal. It is absolutely true that sin separates us from God. But it's also true that Jesus did this amazing thing where he came and died on a cross and rose again. And if we put our faith and our belief and our trust in him, and if we follow him, then sin is not something that separates us from God anymore, because our sin falls on him and not on ourselves. Right? So sin tells you that you're on one side and you're on the other, right? And that God is on the other. Right? But remember what we said before. If you're a follower of Jesus, you are as close to God as you will ever get. You live in him and he lives in you. Right? You cannot get any closer than that. And the problem is we forget that all too easily. Sin makes us think that there is still this big divide between us and God. And the reality is that God is standing right there with you, standing right there next to you. And he's saying this: quit trying to hide. Quit putting on your mask. Quit trying to avoid the shame. Quit pretending like nothing's wrong. Quit trying to fix it yourself. And right, isn't that what the Christian life feels like sometimes, that we're always just trying to fix ourselves, or someone else is always trying to fix us? And then if we can ever get fixed, then God will truly be happy with us. God will truly love us. And only then and only then can we experience the life that God intended for us. But what if it was less important that anything gets fixed, and more important that nothing ever had to be hidden? What if it was less important that anything get fixed, and more important that nothing ever had to be hidden? Listen to what Paul says. After all of these verses about talking about his struggle with sin and doing what he doesn't want to do and not doing what he does want to do, listen to what he says next. He says, "Therefore, there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus." There is no condemnation. Sin does not define you. It does not push God away. It does not hold him at a distance. Yes, there are still consequences to your sin. This is not a get out of jail free card. This is not a sin permission slip. It's not an excuse to keep sinning, but it's an invitation to face your sin with God, instead of an invitation to face your sin in order to get to God. Paul says this: there's no condemnation. You are already with God. You can approach your sin with God instead of approaching your sin in order to get to God. Imagine a life of trusting God with your sin in that way, where your relationship with God is not gauged on what you did or what you didn't do, but on how much you trust him. And when shame and condemnation can give way to trust and confrontation, where instead of hiding it, we go, "This is my sin, God, help me get through this, help me get over this, help me get past this." We stop trying to manage our sin. We stop approaching it with good intentions, and we just face it together with the one who has already overcome sin. So how does that work? How do we find that freedom? How do we approach sin without shame and condemnation? Well, that's exactly what we are going to talk about next week as we conclude this series, The Masquerade. Before we go, there's a few questions that to keep the conversation going. You can talk about it over lunch or maybe in a small group if you're in one of those. The first question is this: share a list of all of your sins. That is absolutely not what you should do in these conversations. That sounds like a terrible conversation. Here's the real question. Number one, what is your most embarrassing or shameful moment that you're willing to share, right? We've all got something embarrassing, something shameful that we're willing to share. You may not want to go too deep in there, but you can share something. Number two, read Romans 7:15. That's where he says, I do not understand. I don't understand it. I keep doing the things I don't want to do, and I can't do the things that I want to do. Have you ever related to Paul in this sentiment? What other areas or disciplines of your life have you found it difficult to conquer? And then number three, how has your personal battle with your sin nature affected the way you see God and how you think he sees you? Have you viewed him as far off or close by you? Does that ever change for you? Let's pray. God, we thank you for who you are. God, we thank you that you love us. God, we thank you that no matter what we're going through, no matter what we're facing, God, you are willing to face that with us. God, and so many times that we just want to hide. We want to pretend like it's not there, whether in front of other people, whether in front of you, or we're captive by sin. We're bound by sin. God, we're afraid of shame. We don't want to feel those types of things in our lives, and so we don't know how to deal with it. We just try to manage it. We just try with our best intentions, but we wind up failing time and time again. God, but you've given us a way to move past that, God, because of Jesus, because what he did. There is no condemnation for us, God. When you look at us, you don't see our sin. God, we don't have to conquer our sin in order to get to you. God, we can walk with you as we try to move past those things. God, help us to understand how to do that, how to live in that freedom, to how to have that relationship of trusting you. In your name we pray. Amen.